a struggling rancher
45. Do
bought
I
a
hear 50?
$39-year-old from child labor.
$50 bid
But
now.
what kind of life
55.
leaves a woman nearly 50 scarred and discarded as if she were worth nothing? How much pain must she have carried in silence, treated as a burden instead of a human being? And when one weary man took her hand, could it truly become the moment her whole life began again? The auction yard smelled of sweat dust and desperation. The year was long behind the war, but the West still carried the ache of hunger and the weight of too many broken lives. Among the pens of livestock and the clamor of men shouting bids, a woman stood. Her hair was tangled, her dress threadbare, her body marked by years of toil. She was not a girl, not anymore. She was 39, old enough, the traders said, to have lost her bloom, yet still strong enough to work. They called her Clara. She kept her eyes low as the bidding began. She had learned since childhood that meeting a man's stare often meant trouble. Her father had sold her into labor when she was barely 11 after her mother died. From that day, Clara had been passed from one place to another, cooking, scrubbing, bending her back under the sun, treated as though her worth were measured only in how many hours she could endure. $2, someone barked. $1.50, another shouted, laughing. Their voices broke against her like stones thrown into a river. She held herself still, breathing slow, holding on to the one thing no man had ever taken from her, her dignity. Even in rags, even when her stomach ached with hunger, Clara would not bow her head in shame. At the edge of the crowd stood a man in a worn hat and faded coat. His boots carried the dust of miles and his shoulders the weight of debts. His name was Thomas, a struggling rancher, whose cattle had dwindled, whose nights were filled with the sound of empty winds rushing through his barn. He had not come to buy a laborer. He had come seeking tools, maybe a mule, something to stretch his season a little longer. But then his gaze fell upon Clara, not on her torn dress, not on the hollowness in her cheeks. What caught him was the quiet fire in her stance, the way she stood upright even as men reduced her to a price. Something in his chest tightened. $1, someone sneered. She's nearly past her use. Thomas's voice came low. Steady, I'll pay the full $2. The crowd hushed. It wasn't a large sum, but the certainty in his tone turned heads. Clara lifted her eyes for the first time meeting his. She expected mockery, perhaps cruelty. Instead, she found a stillness like a river that had known floods yet kept flowing. The gavel struck. Sold. And just like that, her life changed course. When Thomas stepped forward, Clara braced herself. She had been sold before. It usually meant more chains, more nights of exhaustion. But instead of grabbing her arm roughly, Thomas tipped his hat. "Ma'am," he said softly, as if the word itself might help stitch her torn edges back together. "You'll come with me." She studied him, wary. No one had ever said it like that before, not as command but as invitation. As they walked away from the auction yard, Clara felt the weight of many eyes on her back. Whispers followed: a fool rancher, a worthless woman, they won't last a season. But she kept step beside him, wondering if perhaps for the first time in her life, the story would not end the way the world expected. Her hands, calloused and raw, clutched the small bundle of belongings she carried. She told herself not to hope. Hope was dangerous. Hope was a river that could drown you if you let it. Yet beside Thomas, she felt a small stirring, like the faintest green shoot breaking through dry earth. Would this be another chapter of hardship, or the first page of a life where she might finally be more than a laborer, more than a trade? In the silence of that long walk from the auction yard, Clara's heart whispered a question she did not dare speak aloud. Could this man see me for who I am, not what I've been sold to be? The wagon creaked along the dirt road as Thomas guided the horses away from the crowded auction yard. The sun was beginning its slow descent, painting the Wyoming sky with muted oranges and violets. Beside him sat Clara, her bundle of belongings clutched to her chest as though it were both shield and anchor. Neither spoke for a long while. The quiet between them wasn't sharp or uncomfortable, but heavy like a silence that carried years of unspoken stories. Clara kept her gaze fixed on the horizon, afraid that if she looked at him too closely, she might see pity in his eyes. And pity was something she could not bear. At last, Thomas cleared his throat. "You've worked hard before," he said, voice gentle, not questioning, but acknowledging. Clara gave a small nod. "Since I was a girl, kitchens, fields, anywhere there was a hand needed." Thomas nodded slowly, his hands steady on the reins. "Then you know more about work than most men I've hired." Clara blinked. The words weren't flattery, they were respect. She had not been spoken to like that in decades. For a moment, she let herself breathe a little easier. By the time the wagon rolled into his ranch, dusk had spread its violet shadows. The house was plain but solid, weather-worn boards patched with care. A lantern flickered in the window, casting a faint glow. Behind the barn, a handful of cattle shifted restlessly, thin from the hard season. The ranch looked tired, much like its owner, but still standing. Thomas helped her down not by dragging her arm, but by extending his hand. Clara hesitated before placing her palm in his, surprised at the warmth there. His hand was rough with work, yet careful as though he knew how to hold without breaking. Inside the small cabin, Clara found neat order. No luxury, only the bare necessities: a sturdy wooden table, a few shelves of stove, and 2 chairs. She noticed a cradle in the corner, empty but polished, as if it had been tended even in sorrow. She did not ask, though the sight pressed heavily against her chest. "I don't expect more of you than you can give," Thomas said, setting her bundle on the table. "You'll have food, a roof, and your own space here. Work we'll share between us." Clara frowned. "Why buy me then? You could have hired a man." Thomas met her gaze. His eyes were weary but kind, touched with something she couldn't name. "Because men don't carry the kind of strength I saw in you today, and because no one deserves to be traded like cattle." The words caught her off guard. She had always believed herself invisible, seen only as weight or labor. Yet this man had noticed something different. Something she had nearly forgotten still lived in her. That night, Clara lay in the small bed Thomas had offered. The mattress was lumpy but softer than any ground she had slept on in years. She stared at the ceiling beams, her hands clasped over her chest, feeling the strangeness of safety. She had no master shouting orders, no overseer watching her every move. Only the steady sound of Thomas moving about the cabin, stoking the fire, pouring water into the basin. Her heart wrestled with itself. She wanted to trust, but life had taught her trust could turn to chains overnight. Still, something about his quiet presence felt different, like the slow thaw of frost after a long winter. In the darkness, she whispered a question to the rafters. "Is this where my story turns, Lord, or just another chapter of sorrow?" The only answer was the steady crackle of firewood and the faint peace of knowing for one night at least she was not alone. As Clara drifted into sleep, her heart trembled between fear and fragile hope. Was Thomas truly different, or would tomorrow reveal the same cruel script she had known all her life? The first days on the ranch passed like a cautious dance. Clara woke before dawn, her body already trained to the rhythm of endless labor. She lit the stove. Boiled water swept the cabin floor, though none of it had been asked of her. It was simply what she knew to survive by working harder than anyone else. Thomas noticed. He would step in from the barn to find the fire already burning bread, already rising in the pan. More than once he tried to tell her, "You don't have to do all this," but Clara would only bow her head and answer, "It's better this way." Still, the silence between them began to soften. She listened to the way he spoke to the cattle, not with frustration, but with patience, as though each animal carried its own small dignity. And he noticed how, even with hands scarred and weary, Clara's touch on a young calf was gentle, coaxing trust instead of fear. But not all was tender. One afternoon, Thomas returned from town with supplies. Whispers had already reached him. "You paid for her like a mule," someone muttered at the mercantile. "A desperate man with a worthless woman." The words had stung, but Thomas said nothing. He was not a man to waste words on gossip. When he came back, he found Clara by the well hauling water with her sleeves rolled. She looked older in the harsh sunlight, the lines on her face deepened by years of hardship. For a moment he feared she had heard the same cruel whispers. "Folks in town can be sharp," he said, setting down the sack of flour. "Don't pay them no mind." Clara met his eyes, her expression unreadable. "I've been called worse since I was a girl," she said quietly. "Words can't skin me alive anymore." Her voice was steady, but Thomas caught the flicker of pain underneath. It twisted something inside him. He had known hunger, debt, the ache of loneliness, but he had never known what it was to live every day as if your worth was measured less than dirt. That night, Clara hesitated by the cradle in the corner. She finally asked the question she had swallowed for days. "Was there a child?" Thomas's jaw tightened. He looked at the cradle, then back at her. "There was a son. He didn't make it through the fever." His voice broke just slightly, and Clara understood why the cradle had been kept polished, cared for, but empty. It was a scar he carried quietly the way she carried her own. For the first time, Clara saw not just a rancher, but a man hollowed by loss. And in that hollow space, she recognized something familiar, because she too had lived with absences that no one else could see. The next morning, while she kneaded dough, Thomas came in from the barn. He leaned against the doorway, watching her hands move. "Clara," he said at last, "you don't need to prove yourself here. This isn't another place where you're bought to be broken." She froze, her hands buried in flour. Her chest ached with the truth of it. She had lived so long proving her worth, she didn't know how to simply be. "I wouldn't know what to do with myself if I wasn't working," she admitted. Thomas stepped closer. "Then work with me, not for me. We'll figure the rest together." The words settled over her like a blanket on a cold night. Not ownership, not command, partnership. It was something she had never been offered before. And yet Clara's heart wrestled. Could she believe it? Could she trust that his kindness wasn't another mask waiting to fall away? As the sun rose over the ranch, Clara wondered, was this fragile respect the seed of something greater, or just another illusion the world would snatch away? The weeks wore on, and with them came whispers that crept from town to ranch like tumbleweed rolling with the wind. Clara felt them before she heard them. Every time she went with Thomas to the mercantile, eyes turned sharp as broken glass, measuring her body, her age, her place at his side. One woman muttered near the sugar barrels, "Imagine him bringing her into his house." Another snickered, "Didn't know ranchers were that desperate." Clara stood still, her hands clenched around the sack of flour she carried. For a heartbeat, she thought of dropping it and fleeing back into the dust. But Thomas's steady hand brushed against hers, quiet but firm. He didn't glare at the women. He didn't speak a word of defense. Instead, he looked only at Clara as if no one else existed. "We've got what we came for. Let's head home." On the wagon ride back, Clara tried to hide her trembling. Years of humiliation had taught her silence. But the words spilled out like water through a crack in a dam. "Why do you let them talk? Why don't you tell them I'm not?" She broke off, her throat tight. Not worthless, not shame, not the burden they thought. Thomas kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Because I don't answer to them, and neither do you." The wind carried his words across the prairie, steady as the rhythm of hooves. But Clara felt the old scars inside her wrestle. Could she really believe it? Could she let herself walk upright, unashamed in a world that had only ever spit her name like poison? That evening, she stood at the basin, washing the day's dishes, her reflection shimmering in the water's surface. She caught sight of her hands, calloused, veins strong. These hands had baked bread, held crying children, mended torn clothes, and carried burdens others refused to see. And yet all her life, people had measured her worth by her body, by the shape that did not fit their narrow mold of beauty. She whispered to herself, "I am more than what they see." Behind her, Thomas entered, quietly drying his hands on a cloth. He seemed to hear what she had not meant to say aloud. "A woman who's lived through fire and still keeps her dignity, that's worth more than land or gold." Her breath caught. She turned, meeting his gaze. In his eyes, she didn't see pity nor the greedy calculation of men who had bought and sold her. She saw recognition, as if he had been searching the whole prairie for someone who could understand the weight of loss and still stand tall. Still, the world pressed hard. One night, a neighbor rode by with whiskey on his breath, shouting from the gate, "Hey, Thomas, couldn't find a real bride, so you took a worn-out mule." His laughter echoed through the dry air. Clara froze, shame burning her skin. But before she could shrink back, Thomas stepped out onto the porch. His voice was calm, but it carried the kind of steel that made men pause. "Say one more word about her, and you'll be the one who looks like a mule when the sun comes up." The drunk man muttered, cursed, then rode off into the darkness. Clara stood there trembling, not from fear this time, but from something she had not felt in years, the shock of being defended, of being chosen, of being seen. Later, when the lamps were dim and the house lay in stillness, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands pressed to her chest. She knew the battle wasn't just with wagging tongues or cruel neighbors. The real fight was inside her, against the voice that had lived in her bones since childhood, the voice that said she was unworthy of love. For the first time, she felt the voice weaken, not vanish, not yet, but falter under the weight of one man's quiet respect. As she closed her eyes that night, Clara wondered could she learn to silence the cruel voices of her past and believe that she was worthy of the love standing before her. The next morning, Clara stepped onto the porch alone. The prairie stretched before her wide and endless, as if daring her to claim her place beneath the sky. For years she had walked with her shoulders bowed, shrinking herself to fit inside other people's scorn. But today she breathed deeper. The cold air filled her lungs like the first real meal after a season of hunger. She picked up the broom to sweep the porch, as was her habit, but this time she paused. Instead of rushing to labor, she simply leaned on it, watching the horizon. For once she let herself stand still. Inside, Thomas was mending harness leather. He glanced through the open door, quietly noticing. He said nothing, but the faintest smile touched his lips. He knew this was no ordinary stillness. It was Clara claiming her right to rest. That afternoon, Clara took the wagon into town alone for the first time. She walked into the mercantile, her steps heavy but steady. The same women who once snickered now whispered again. She heard them, yes, but for the first time their words slid off her like rain on oiled leather. She bought flour beans and lamp oil, thanked the clerk, and walked out with her head high. Outside, a small boy tugged at her skirt. "Ma'am, you dropped this." He held up a handkerchief she hadn't noticed slipping from her pocket. Clara knelt, taking it gently. "Thank you, sweetheart." Her voice trembled, but not from shame, only from the tenderness of being treated with simple kindness. On the way home, she stopped the wagon at the riverbank. She climbed down and sat by the water, pulling the handkerchief into her lap. Its edges were worn, its fabric thin. It reminded her of herself, threadbare from years of use, yet still holding together. She whispered to the river, "I am still here. I am still me." For the first time in decades, she didn't feel the need to apologize for her existence. When she returned, Thomas was waiting by the barn, his brow furrowed in concern. "You took longer than I expected. I stopped by the river," she said. "I needed to hear myself again." He nodded, his eyes soft. "Did you?" Clara smiled faintly, a smile that felt new, almost foreign. "Yes. And I heard something I haven't heard in years, my own voice, without the weight of theirs." That evening, as the prairie wind howled outside, Clara sat by the fire. She untied the kerchief she had worn for so long, the one that hid her thinning hair, the lines of her face. Slowly, deliberately, she set it aside. Thomas, sitting across from her, looked up. His eyes didn't widen. He didn't flinch. He simply saw her, the scars of time, the tired beauty, the strength that had carried her across years of rejection. "You don't need to hide," he said quietly. For a long moment, Clara could not speak. Tears slipped down her cheeks, not from sorrow this time, but from the strange freedom of being unmasked, of being enough. She realized then that liberation was not loud. It did not come in battles or shouts. It came in small choices: to stand still, to walk forward, to take off the cloth, to breathe, as if the world had no right to deny her air. That night when she lay in bed, she whispered into the dark, "I am not owned. I am not worthless. I am here." And for the first time in her long life, she believed it. Yet as Clara found this fragile freedom, she knew the past had a way of circling back, testing every newfound strength. What would happen when the world pushed harder than ever before? The winter wind cut sharp across the prairie, carrying with it not just cold, but memories. Clara had begun to find her footing on Thomas's ranch, but whispers in town still lingered. They clung like birds determined to follow her home. One afternoon, as she stacked wood by the barn, a rider approached. His hat was pulled low, but Clara knew that posture, that gait. A shiver crept down her spine. It was Elias, her former brother-in-law, the one who had once called her a burden no man should have to carry. He dismounted, his eyes sweeping over her with the same disdain he had shown 20 years ago. "Didn't think I'd see you again, Clara. Thought you'd have faded into the dust by now." Clara stood straighter, though her heart pounded. "And yet here I am." He chuckled, mean and dry. "A rancher took you in, did he? Must have been desperate." Before Clara could answer, Thomas stepped out of the barn, leather gloves in hand. His jaw tightened when he saw Elias. "State your business," Thomas said evenly. "I've no business with you," Elias sneered. "Only with her. I came to remind her what she is. Trash doesn't turn into treasure just because it's hauled into a new barn." Clara's breath caught old wounds opening wide. For a moment, she felt herself shrinking again, small and powerless, the girl who had endured years of ridicule. But Thomas stepped forward, planting himself between them. His voice was low, steady as a mountain. "You've had your say. Now leave." Elias spat into the dirt. "Mark my words, rancher. She'll ruin you. Women like her always do." He swung into the saddle and rode off, dust rising in his wake. Clara stood frozen, her hands trembling. Thomas turned to her, his gaze softening. "Don't let his poison back into you." But that night when the lamps burned low, Clara lay awake, Elias's words circling her mind. Trash, burden, ruin. Could Thomas truly bear the weight of her past, or would he too one day see what Elias claimed to see? Days passed and Clara found herself quieter, more withdrawn. She cooked, she worked, but her laughter, newborn and fragile, fell silent again. Thomas noticed. One evening after supper, he placed his hand over hers. "Tell me what's eating you." Clara hesitated, then whispered, "What if he's right? What if all I've ever been is a burden? And you just don't see it yet?" Thomas leaned closer, his eyes steady. "Clara, I see you clearer than you see yourself. You are not a burden. You are the backbone of this place. Without you, the house would be walls and dust. With you, it's home." Tears stung her eyes. No man had ever spoken to her like that, without pity, without mockery, but with truth. Still doubt lingered. The next week when Clara went to town again, the whispers rose louder than ever. She heard one man mutter, "That rancher must have lost his mind taking her in." Another woman said, "It won't last. She's not made for anything but sorrow." Clara carried her sack of flour out to the wagon, her body stiff, her face pale. She wanted to run, to hide, to give in to the voices that told her she didn't belong. But as she reached the wagon, she saw Thomas waiting there. He had left his work early to meet her. He didn't say a word, he only reached out his hand. And in that simple act, Clara realized something: the world might never stop jeering. The whispers might never fully die, but she had a choice. She could keep living chained to their words, or she could step forward into the hand that offered her something stronger: respect, belonging, love. Her fingers trembled as she placed them in his. It felt like stepping into sunlight after years of shadow. That night, as Clara clung to Thomas's hand, she knew the true test lay ahead, not in silencing others, but in finally believing in her own worth. Would she be able to claim it fully and let herself be loved? Spring came quietly to the valley. The snow melted into streams that ran silver under the cottonwoods, and the earth seemed to breathe again. Clara stood at the porch rail, watching the light spread across the pasture. She had lived through many seasons, but never one that felt so much like a new beginning. And yet in her chest a storm still lingered. The cruel voices in town, Elias's sneer, the echoes of her past, they all tried to claw her back. It was one thing to hear Thomas's words of love. It was another thing entirely to believe them, to live inside them, as if they were true. One morning, the twin girls, Lydia and May, ran across the yard with flowers clutched in their small hands. They placed the blossoms on Clara's apron, beaming. "Papa says these are for you," Lydia said. May added, "He says you're the reason the ranch feels warm again." Clara's throat tightened. She knelt, pulling the girls into her arms. Their giggles, their trust, their simple certainty, it was a balm no cruel voice could erase. That evening, Clara found Thomas mending a fence by the barn. She stood quietly until he looked up, his face weathered by sun and wind softened at the sight of her. "Thomas," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "why me? Out of all the women you could have chosen, why the one everyone else called worthless?" He set down his hammer and walked toward her, stopping close enough that she could see the earnest fire in his eyes. "Because I don't measure worth the way they do. They see scars and call them shame. I see scars and call them survival. They see your size and call it a burden. I see the strength it took to keep standing year after year. Clara, I chose you because you are the strongest, kindest soul I've ever known." Her tears fell freely, now hot and cleansing. Thomas cupped her face, rough hands gentle. "Let them talk, Clara. Let them sneer. As long as I'm breathing, you will never stand alone again." For the first time in decades, Clara allowed herself to believe him, truly believe him. That night after supper, Thomas gathered the girls and Clara on the porch. The lantern light flickered softly against the wooden beams, and the prairie stretched wide under a sea of stars. I've been thinking, Thomas began, clearing his throat. We've all carried sorrow long enough. It's time we name what we are family. The twins clapped, squealing with delight. Clara covered her mouth, overwhelmed. Clara, Thomas said, turning to her, his voice steady and tender. You're not here as a guest. You're not here as charity. I want you as my partner, my wife, the heart of this home. Will you marry me? The words hung in the air, trembling like a note of music waiting to resolve. Clara's breath caught. For so many years she had imagined love as something meant for others, never for her. And now here it was offered, not in pity, not in haste, but in reverence. Slowly she nodded, her voice breaking into a whisper. Yes, Thomas. Yes. The twins cheered, wrapping their arms around her waist. Thomas pulled her close, pressing his forehead against hers. In that embrace, Clara felt the final chain of shame slip away. She was no longer defined by the cruelty of the past. She was chosen, cherished home. The months that followed were filled with work fences, to mend fields to sow, but beneath it all a current of joy ran steady. Clara woke each morning, not with dread, but with gratitude. She cooked not in silence, but to the sound of children's laughter. She walked into town not with bowed head, but with her hand in Thomas's, unafraid of the whispers. Some voices still tried to wound, but Clara no longer gave them power. She had learned that dignity is not given by others, it is claimed by the soul. And she had claimed hers. On their wedding day, beneath a sky streaked with gold, Clara stood beside Thomas, the twins clutching her skirts, and felt her heart settle like a bird at last returning home. For the first time, Clara understood love was not something she had begged for in vain. It had been waiting patient, as the prairie itself, until she was ready to open her heart and receive it. Clara had once believed her story ended in sorrow. But here in the arms of a man who saw her worth, she discovered it was only the beginning. Isn't that what all of us hope for? That no matter how late love comes, when it arrives, it is enough to heal everything. The valley changed with the seasons, but Clara's heart had changed even more. Once she had thought her story would be nothing but survival, a string of days stitched together with silence and duty. Now she woke to the sound of laughter, to Thomas's steady footsteps on the porch, and to the twin voices of Lydia and May calling her Mama as though it had always been her name. Still, there were shadows that tried to follow her. At church, she could feel the sharp eyes of women who remembered her past, who whispered behind fans and gloved hands. She's not fit to be a rancher's wife, they murmured. A woman like her ought to hide. The words stung, but they did not pierce her the way they once might have. She had Thomas's hand in hers, his steady squeeze reminding her she was not alone. One night, Clara sat by the fire mending a dress. Thomas watched her from across the room, his face softened by the lamplight. You're thinking again, he said. Clara smiled faintly. I'm always thinking. Tell me, he urged. She hesitated, then spoke. I keep wondering why you chose me. After all the pain, all the shame, why not someone untouched by it all? Thomas rose, kneeling before her, his calloused hands covering hers. Because I wasn't looking for perfect. I was looking for real. And Clara, you are the truest person I have ever known. You've carried scars, yes, but you've also carried love through it all. That is what makes you beautiful. Her eyes filled. It was as if the words wrapped around her, binding her not in chains, but in safety. For the first time in her 50 years, Clara believed that love was not pity, not accident, but choice. Weeks later, under the wide Wyoming sky, Thomas gathered Clara and the girls outside. The prairie wind carried the scent of sage and wild grass, and the sunset blazed copper on the horizon. I've been thinking, he said, looking at each of them. We've lived as family in all but name. I think it's time we make it true. Clara, will you marry me? The girls gasped, clutching Clara's skirts. Clara's hand trembled against her chest. She had been asked before long ago by men who saw her as convenience or labor. Never like this, never as someone treasured. Tears blurred her vision. Yes, she whispered then, louder, steadier. Yes, Thomas. The girls cheered, and Thomas pulled her into his arms. The embrace was not fiery passion alone. It was promise. It was home. Clara leaned into him, feeling the weight of decades slip away. Epilogue. The wedding was simple, a small gathering at the ranch, the sound of the twins' giggles carrying louder than any hymn. Clara wore a dress she had sewn herself, modest and strong like her. Thomas stood tall, but his hands shook when he placed the ring on her finger. From that day, Clara no longer flinched when she entered town. Whispers still followed, but they no longer mattered. What mattered was Thomas's steady gaze, the children's arms around her waist. The truth she carried within: she was loved fully and without condition. She had once believed her life would end in loneliness. Instead, she found her heart had only been waiting for the right man, the right moment, the right chance to be seen. Love, she realized, had not passed her by. It had simply arrived late, patient, and enduring, like the river that keeps flowing, no matter how many stones lie in its path. And so Clara's story closed, not with sorrow, but with hope, hope that whispered to every soul like hers: it is never too late to be chosen, never too late to be loved. Clara thought her story had ended years ago in silence and shame, but now, standing hand in hand with Thomas under the endless western sky, she knew it was only just beginning. Isn't that what we all long for? That even in our later years, love can still find us. In the end, what seemed like nothing more than a desperate purchase became the beginning of something neither Clara nor Thomas could have imagined. She, once broken by years of child labor and humiliation, discovered that her worth was never tied to what others took from her. He, worn down by hardship and loneliness, found that true strength is not in surviving alone, but in opening one's heart to another. Their story is not just about two people, it is a reminder for all of us. Life may bend us, scar us, even convince us that our time for love or dignity has passed. But sometimes the very moment we believe everything is over is the moment something new begins. Perhaps you have felt overlooked or carried burdens in silence. Let Clara's journey remind you that you are never beyond hope. Love, whether romantic, familial, or the simple kindness of a friend, can still find its way to you. If this story touched you, I invite you to share your thoughts. Do you believe in second chances even late in life? Have you witnessed love or dignity restored when it seemed impossible? Leave a comment below. I would love to hear your reflections. And if you'd like to journey with us through more stories of hope and healing on the frontier, don't forget to subscribe to None Wild West Saga. Share this story with someone who may need it, and together let's keep alive the truth that love and dignity belong to every soul, no matter the age.